Hi, everyone. My name is Don Saucier. I'm the Faculty Associate Director of the Teaching and Learning Center, and you have found your way to our professional development series. We are very excited to have you all here every noon on Zoom at Wednesday, and we also record these for asynchronous viewing after the fact, post them on our website. We're going to begin today with land acknowledgement.
Okay, let me share my screen and hopefully audio as well. Okay. Don, can you see my screen? Okay, perfect. Here we go.
As the first land-grant institution established under the 1862 Morrill Act, we acknowledge that the state of Kansas is, historically, home to many native nations, including the Kaw, Osage, and Pawnee, among others. Furthermore, Kansas is the current home to 4 federally recognized native nations: the Prairie Band Potawatomi, the Kickapoo Tribe of Kansas, the Iowa Tribe of Kansas and Nebraska, and the Sac and Fox Nation Missouri in Kansas and Nebraska.
Many native nations utilize the western plains of Kansas as their hunting grounds, and others, such as the Delaware, were moved through this region during Indian removal efforts to make way for white settlers. It's important to acknowledge this, since the land that serves as the foundation of this institution was, and still is, stolen land.
We remember these truths because K-State's status as a land-grant institution is a story that exists within ongoing settler colonialism and rests on the dispossession of indigenous peoples and nations from their lands. These truths are often invisible to many. The recognition that K-State's history begins and continues through indigenous contexts is essential.
Please remember
these truths
because we still remember.
Thank you. I'd like to remind everybody that attending our professional development series, you have the opportunity to earn a professional development certificate from the Teaching and Learning Center. We have these certificates both for graduate teaching assistants as well as for faculty and staff. My colleagues have just dropped a link to that in the chat. I want to put in your radars for next week. Next week, there's a number of events that are done across our campus on artificial intelligence, a topic that is impacting many of our classes right now. Our event next week will be Clarissa Steele talking about artificial intelligence in higher education, a primer. And I imagine that's going to be something of interest for a lot of us in our teaching. Information about the other events that are offered next week have been dropped in the chat by my colleagues as well. Today, though, we are very excited to have Dr. Alex Redcorn, who'll be talking to us today in his talk entitled Improving Teaching and Learning About, For, and With American Indians. Dr. Redcorn, the floor is yours.
All right, welcome, and thanks for the invite to be here. And I'm kind of thrilled to have this conversation with folks here. I see some folks in the room that I recognize. I also see some folks I don't recognize. And what's also funny about this is I've given a version of this talk all over the state of Kansas, and some people that I recognize, I don't know if you've ever seen me doing the talk before. We've talked about other things. And so what I'm going to present here today, and I'm going to go ahead and start sharing screen here, is really a similar, it kind of gets to the core issues and background information for understanding how to improve our education systems and teaching and learning environments about American Indians. But it's also about, for, and with Native Americans. And that's kind of how I tend to frame things. So before I get started, though, I'd love to know who's in the room. And I also enjoyed the chat. Please use the chat while I'm going. And if you have an opportunity to say who you are and kind of what you're representing, who you're representing, what content areas you're representing, that'll also help me better understand how to adapt moving forward. But the thing is, when we have an eclectic group, so sometimes I'm talking directly to social studies teachers. Sometimes I'm talking broadly to students. Sometimes I'm talking broadly to faculty and staff. And so I'm going to talk about the broad topics that everybody should be thinking about. For some of y'all, this may be kind of a duh 101, like Indian 101 type conversation that you may have already had versions of before. But it's I never know where to start because the baseline for all audiences, I actually, when we talk about American Indians and educational systems, I tend to have similar conversations with both third graders and teachers and principals and superintendents and faculty members. That kind of tells you the baseline understanding that you can expect in an audience is really one of the issues that we're trying to address as educators, right? And so, I'll go ahead and get started. And yeah, if you could put your name and I already got your name, but check out who all's in here. Okay. So as those come in, I'm going to check them out as we go. But who am I? So my Osage name is Samoy. I'm a citizen of the Osage Nation. That's that first word right there is Tsijewashtake, Gentle Sky Peacekeeper Clan, and I'm from the Wahakaleen District near Pawhuska, Oklahoma. Here's Deborah coming to heckle me. All right. So no, but I'm from the Wahakaleen District. Has anybody ever been to Pawhuska? Hold on. We got Deborah in here. Hold on. I got to switch to gallery view. Has anybody been to Pawhuska? The great city of Pawhuska, Oklahoma. I asked because the Pioneer Woman's down there, and maybe we'll talk about that a little bit later. And so it tends to, more often in the present, people have gone to Pawhuska, where in the past they haven't. And Killers of the Flower Moon is coming out, so I imagine people are going to be intrigued by that. That's about my home community as well. So I'm a former social studies teacher. That's where I got my bachelor's and master's at KU, if I'm allowed to say that. And then I got my ed leadership doctorate at K-State. And so that's where I specialize in American Indian systems of ed. And Wahoin, this is my family. So I got brothers. We got the red kernels in the upper left-hand corner. And this is an old picture. These folks are getting old now too. So growing up, but I'm just going to leave that picture in there because it makes me feel like I'm younger. But so I often frame this around the concept of evolving together. And this is a really important piece, how we frame things, because on one hand, we could be talking about systems of racism in education. Historically, systems of education have been weaponized against American Indian peoples. But at the same time, we have to have conversations. We have to have uncomfortable conversations. I like to frame what we're doing as evolving together. Historically, systems of ed have been weaponized against Indigenous peoples. We're all agents of change within these systems. And we've inherited some problematic status quos. So we are agents of change within these systems. So we have to have these conversations so we can evolve our systems. Our systems, remember, I'm an ed leadership person. Our systems are always ever evolving, and we are the people that control those systems. So once we point out some stubborn status quos that exist, sometimes it becomes easier to reframe the work that we're doing. But I also emphasize about, for, and with. So about, we have lesson planning, we have curricular materials, we have textbooks, we have media selections, things that we bring into our classrooms to teach about American Indians and Indigenous peoples. But we also have these American Indian and Indigenous students, not just American Indian, but Indigenous students from all over the world, are in almost every district in our state, and that translates over into higher education as well. Okay, so these are the American Indian enrollments. So a lot of times we think about American Indians are just like these people that are relegated to the reservations that we never see, or we drive past that one random highway and we see a casino and that's all we know. That's kind of how a lot of people envision it, but they're in your classrooms. And if you look at me, secret's out, I'm also white. All right, so if you look at me, you also notice that we don't look like the stereotypes that one would expect. So they may be in your classrooms, they may not look like what you think they look like. So about, for, and with. So how are we engaging our American Indian nations and communities in Kansas? So I'll talk a little bit about some of the work we're doing at the state level to try to improve our systems of ed. And we'll get to a certain point where it'll kind of rely on questions on what you all need from me. And so we have way too much content to talk about. So as we engage, or as I see things in the chat, maybe that will dictate which slides I jump to. All right. So let's evolve together. All right. And let's get started. A baseline 101 question that I get all the time. Which term should I use? I don't like to get caught up on this too much. It freezes people up sometimes. And but if you're going to think about some logic on how to go about it, you will hear different communities use the word Indian, American Indian, Native American, Native, First Nations. Up in Canada, you'll hear a lot. You're also seeing an increase in the term Indigenous, which ties you to a global conversation because Turns out the reason they speak English in New Zealand and Australia is because England also went there. And the reason they speak Spanish in South America, like the concept of colonialism spread across the globe, and there's a shared experience. And when we use the term indigenous and indigenous studies, those fields of study move across the oceans. All right. And there's a lot of collaborations that happen across those oceans. But whenever possible, use tribally specific terms: Osage, Kaw, Cherokee. All right, Deborah, Wingay. Like those specific tribal names are really important because that's a unique cultural identity, and always rolling everybody into broad American Indian genericism erodes that cultural integrity that actually belong to each nation. Also, you're seeing a shift away. Well, depends on what community you're in. So I've heard academics start shifting away from the term tribe, because when you say the word tribe, people invoke a certain imagery that goes with that. When it's native nations, tribal nations, these are nations of people, not just, like, in the background of the Lion King or something like that. Like that kind of imagery comes up when people think about tribe or tribes of indigenous peoples, when really what we're talking about in the United States specifically is we are dealing with native nations, and we are citizens of those nations. And so as we move towards that idea of nationhood, and I got QR codes throughout here. If you need me to stop so you can get the QR code and pull it. Basically, this is a QR code that goes to the NCAI, National Congress of the American Indians. They have kind of a Tribal Nations 101 publicly accessible PDF. So if there's any like nationhood, Indian Nations 101 type thing that you need to learn about or need to put in front of your students, this is a good place to go, a good resource. So the need to emphasize Native nations, indigenous peoples are not just an ethnicity. It's a political class, it's a political status. And this has been held up through all kinds of court cases. You see people, for people in social services, the Indian Child Welfare Act, that depends on nationhood, indigenous nations. You have NAGPRA, the Native American Graves and Repatriation Act, that depends on nationhood. And so that's built into the fabric of the United States. And there were 370 treaties signed, and the act of engaging in that treaty making process is the act of recognizing that sovereignty. So if the United States did not engage in a treaty making process, then, or in order for you to engage in a treaty making process, you are acknowledging that that is a nation. All right. And those treaties and those treaty rights still exist today. So when we think about when we resist this idea that Native folks aren't just a race or ethnicity, you have to recognize this political class and this unique political history. And quite often when we talk about governments, remember, I'm a social studies teacher, we say state, federal, local, state, federal, local, state, federal, local. People use those terms all the time when talking about layers of governance, when actuality it's state, federal, local, and tribal. That is part of the fabric of the United States of America, and these tribal governments are part of that fabric, even if they're left off the terminology quite often. And people don't learn about them in schools. By the way, Kansas does not have any mechanism to make sure that people are taught when they graduate high school that Native nations exist as a sovereign nation. Talk about that in a little bit. But when we think about Indian education broadly, we have to make sure we're on the same page, because there are other things that aren't necessarily taught about. And so we can't, some people already know about this, some people don't. Some people, it's like this figment of, I don't know, it's just, these boarding schools and the history of Indian education is not a given. You can't enter a room and know everybody across every high school in the state of Kansas learned about this, so we can move on from it. You have to make sure you're on the starting point. So boarding schools and the history of boarding schools are inherently connected to the history of Kansas. These kill the Indian, save the man, assimilationist approaches to Indian education are what Haskell Indian Nations University in Lawrence, Kansas started as. All right. That was the beginning of it. Haskell has a graveyard. All right. How many schools do you know of have a graveyard? It's not all that common, but Haskell has a graveyard. And it started out with these kill the Indian, save the man, assimilationist, militaristic schooling. And that's the legacy we all inherited. Now, improvements have occurred. So if you want to get into the history of Indian education, for anybody that's teaching a class where this is relevant, The Marion Report of 1928 was this massive investigation. If you think about the Progressive era and coming out of the Progressive era in the Roaring 20s, basically they're like, guys, we should not be doing this. This kill the Indian, the assimilationist approach, it's not working. It's terrible conditions. We're better humans than that. So in 1928, the Marion Report, but if you fast forward to 1969, the Kennedy Report basically said, hey, we're still terrible at this. We're not doing well. We're causing damage. But then you have important moments like the Rough Rock Demonstration School in 1966. So it's funny. So if I say this is the first school under tribal administration, there's an asterisk on that. So I'm going to say it. This is the first school in the history of the United States of America in which tribal government was actually getting to run their own school. You have a Navajo school board, you have Navajo educators, you have Navajo teachers making their own decisions about their own people. 1966 is the first time that happened. However, why did I say there's an asterisk on that? Because when I say that's the first time ever in the United States of America, we're forgetting the fact that Native peoples were on this continent before the United States of America existed, and they had systems of education. And so we can't just always frame our thinking around the United States of America. These educational systems and these systems of teaching and learning predate the arrival of Europeans and the U.S. Constitution. So when we say things like Indian education, right now it's attached to this bureaucratic, treaty-making, federal government, federal trust responsibility type language. But in reality, we have to recognize that the United States of America is younger than all these Native nations and their histories and their systems and their social systems. All right, so Rough Rock Demonstration School is the first time post United States of America that they start controlling their own schools. You have things like the Native American Language Act, the Esther Martinez Language Act. So they've moved into language revitalization and nation-to-nation type building of educational systems. However, it's really important to understand that, well, I'm going to give away something later if I say that. It's a drop in the bucket. It's a drop in the bucket for how much is needed to actually do this work. All right. So these look good on paper, but how much they're actually funded is so pitiful to what is needed to actually do the work that's needed. But you're starting to see more of this kind of become visible. You have with the mass graves found at the residential schools in Canada, which were the same Canadian version of what we did in the United States of America. You have this growth of the Every Child Matters and the Orange Shirt Day movement. And I keep forgetting to update my PowerPoint to get rid of slow transition slides. But the Orange Shirt Day in September, these are really important developments that raise that visibility. So when that happened in Canada, you also have, for the first time, a Native American, Deb Haaland, overseeing the Department of the Interior. The Department of the Interior is where you have the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which is where you find the Bureau of Indian Education. The DOI has never had a Native person in charge, even though that's where Native stuff happens. So you got Deb Haaland in place. These boarding school initiatives or these boarding school mass graves are being found. She says, all right, we're going to do an investigative report. So that's what happens when you have representation. So they do an investigative report, and this is a great primary source to look through to understand boarding schools. But basically, that's Kansas history. There were 12 federal schools in the state of Kansas. And I actually haven't updated it. There's a new heat map. You can go to the Boarding School Coalition. If somebody fancy in the background wants to find that Boarding School Coalition map and put the link in there, I can do it later if nobody finds it. But it's a good resource to have to look at where all these boarding schools were across the country. But this is Kansas history. You have the Potawatomi mission, you have the Shawnee mission, you have the Iowa and Sac and Fox mission, you have the Osage mission. You even have towns called Mission. All right, Shawnee Mission. Like, this assimilationist effort in these boarding schools are inherently part of our histories. All right, that's Kansas history, especially since so many tribes were moved through. You also have children's books coming out like Fall in Line Holden, which is not like an over-the-top, in-your-face kind of the violence of boarding schools, but these children's books are ways that you can have these conversations. And I say this because I was a high school social studies teacher, and one of my favorite things to do was use children's books to talk about big concepts. And so don't be afraid to use children's books in your classrooms to really spark ideas and have tough, because this is about the power of education and as a tool of assimilation and forcing kids to think a certain way in society. And so having tough conversations, sometimes children's books cut out all the crap and let you go straight to the heart of like concepts of power, control, family, and things like that. And so something to think about. But basically, this is Kansas history and it's Kansas present. All right. The BIE, the Bureau of Indian Education, which I just mentioned, is the current version of those boarding schools. All right. There are still boarding schools that exist. Now, you notice their tagline, culture, knowledge, leadership. The BIE no longer is trying to assimilate people. They're trying to revitalize cultures through the Bureau of Indian Education. So it's taking a full 180 on its purposes. However, this exists because those treaties that were signed. The reason American Indians have, I'm going to put in quotes, special school systems that are for them is because when treaties were signed, the United States government said, we promise that we're going to provide health. We're removing you from your homelands. We're forcibly removing you from your homelands. We promise that we will provide health care. We promise we will provide education. We promise we will provide food. And that's why you have things like the Indian Health Services on reservations, because those treaties still exist. Just because they happened a long time ago doesn't mean that they disappeared. All right. In fact, those treaties are younger than the U.S. Constitution. So if we still believe in the U.S. Constitution, things that happened a long time ago, those legal documents, those treaties, those treaty rights, and the federal trust responsibility that comes with it still exists. So it is in the Bureau of Indian Education, and Kansas has two Bureau of Indian Education institutions. One is Haskell Indian Nations University, and the other is Kickapoo Nation School in Powhatan, Kansas. All right. So the problem, though, and I'm talking on a K through 12 context, but the great majority of Native kids are not in BIE schools. 93% are in public schools. And guess what? Most of them go to state institutions, community colleges. All right. They are not. So when they graduate from public schools, they are not always going to a Bureau of Indian Education. They're not all going to Haskell. They're going to K-State, they're going to Pitt State, they're going to Emporia State, they're going to Johns County Community College. The majority of Native students in higher ed are in state-run institutions, not institutions run by their tribe and not institutions run by the Bureau of Indian Education. So what does that mean? We have critical questions that we have to ask. Everybody looks at Kill the Indian, Save the Man stuff, and they're like, we should never do that again. That's a terrible approach to education. That's immoral. It needs to end. But did the assimilationist trajectory ever actually stop? Can we take Kaw language at K-State? Do we offer that? Do we offer a Kaw government course, Kaw history course? Do we offer Osage history, Osage language, Pawnee history, Pawnee language, Pawnee art, Osage art? We don't offer any of those things. We don't have the capacity to offer those things because we don't have that expertise. We have this Western construct of expertise trapped in PhDs and EDDs, and that is not necessarily the expertise that Native nations need in their communities. All right. And so did this assimilationist trajectory ever stop? We have to ask critical questions. What do most students learn about American Indians? All right. How much are we actually learning? If majority of Native kids and the general public are going to public schools that don't teach these things, how can we expect people to know anything different? And so I got a pop quiz here. And if you've ever seen me present, you're not allowed to answer. All right. But if you feel like you're being trapped, you kind of are, but that's all right. Like I said, I teach third graders the same way, and I talk to principals and superintendents, and they tend to have similar answers. All right. Unless I'm talking to a very unique population of people that know and understand certain things, this tends to be a hard pop quiz. All right. How many states are in the United States of America? And how many original colonies make up the United States? 50 nifty United States from 13. Yeah, you learned that early. All right. It's there. Yes, you're being trapped. It's 50 and 13. Okay. All right. Next question. How many native nations are found across the United States? And if you're always working with native people and you know the answer to this, you're not allowed to answer. Let's put some guesses in the chat. And I'm not going to move forward until I have at least 5 guesses in the chat. I'm prompting engagement. Oh, Deborah, you cheater. Giving stuff away. Since Deborah is a graduate of the Indigenous Ed Leadership Certificate,
I got distracted. Sorry.
There are 574 federally recognized tribes in the United States. So if we know 50 nifty United States, 13 original colonies, like that's like, you probably don't even remember when you learned that because you learned it so early. But here we are, some of the most educated people in our state, and we don't know the baseline, like how many federally recognized tribes there are. So that's what we're starting with. Like, what's that Indian 101 level? That's what we're starting with. That's our baseline. And it's only up from here. All right. So we got that taken care of. Let's start moving to the next step. All right. How many tribes are located in Kansas right now? Deborah, you're not allowed to answer. You've been censored. Okay. There we go. We got 4. So we have a little bit more context, and it probably helps with Indigenous Peoples Day, and we just had a land acknowledgement that named them. All right. And so yeah, there are 4 federally recognized tribes: Kickapoo Tribe of Kansas, Prairie Band Potawatomi, Sac and Fox, and Iowa Tribe. You can see the removal in their name: the Sac and Fox Nation of Missouri in Kansas and Nebraska, the Iowa Tribe of Kansas and Nebraska. Where's the Iowa Tribe originally from? Let me think about that for a second. Oh, one of those 50 nifty United States where they basically took their land and forced them to move to Kansas. All right. So this is that other baseline stuff. We need to like get to a point where anybody who graduates from a Kansas high school or a Kansas college, they know baseline. If I'm going to be a citizen in Kansas, there are 4 federally recognized tribes. They're some of the biggest employers in their communities. All right. These are not like, yeah, that we need to recognize these basic starting points to the conversation. And they're all in the upper Northwest. However, do you know whose land you're on originally? They are not from here. All right. They're not from here. We're on Kaw and Osage and Pawnee territory on this part of the state. And when I say this part of the state, somebody might be on the other side of the state jumping in on Zoom. But basically, the eastern half of the state tends to be Paw, Konza, and Osage. All right. But because we were once Indian territory, a lot of the tribes in Oklahoma came through Kansas first. And then Kansas was like, hey, we're going to become a state. We need to get rid of them. And so a lot of those tribes were moved through. So if we know this map should become normal in the state of Kansas. Because how many of you guys drove, if you're driving through Manhattan, you notice the street signs? If you're looking at the counties in East, you got Wyandotte County, you got Shawnee County, you got Mission, Kansas. You got Miami County, south of Johnson County. By the way, Johnson was the one that set up the Shawnee Mission. That's a little problematic. So all these county names are these histories. And lots of folks, I'm in DeSoto, Kansas right now. We have street signs that are all these tribal names on the map on the right. Okay. So, but you're basically sitting on land ceded by majority of Kansas is Kaw or Osage land cessions. These are 2 puzzle pieces that go together. Right? If you look at the left, that's the Kaw Nation land cessions. You can take that piece and put it right on top the orange on the Osage land cessions. All right. And they were both ceded around the same time. Okay. 1825 for both of them. So Kaw and Osage are strong in this area. So that's why we do things like land acknowledgements. So a lot of times people think land acknowledgements are like, hey, you need to go what's the word I'm looking for? Just basically like make all white people and descendants of white settlers feel bad about themselves. No, the land acknowledgement is about acknowledging actual history, because we go through our systems of education and you will learn more about ancient Greece and Rome than you'll learn about Kansas indigenous peoples. The actual people, the actual history of this place. A lot of folks, you can't, if we can't even name that you're on Kaw and Osage territory, but you can tell me about Greek mythology and the Roman Empire, like there's a disconnect there. There's a disconnect to the actual place and lands for which you're on. And so Land Acknowledgement Toolkit, because it's become so popular, we've gotten requests, but having students go through the process, we got to a point where we wanted to create something where people could walk through and think about a land acknowledgement more than just checking a box, and more as a learning tool. What resources can you look to create a land acknowledgement? And how do you tie it to action? Because so often we're doing these land acknowledgements and it's like, okay, check the box, we're being diverse, but are you actually doing anything? We remember these systems of assimilation are embedded and baked into the status quos of our ed systems. I just told you, we can't teach CAW language at K-State. We don't have the resources. We don't Osage language, Osage history, Osage governance. A lot of people don't even know what the Degi-Ha-Siouan language family is, which is basically the language family from this specific area. Omahas, Poncas, Quapaws, Osage, and Kaw. They're all from this area. So how do we go about learning about these people and these places and these histories? And how can we tie it to action within our systems of education? So now I'm getting to one of my favorite activities. And if you've seen me do this, then it's not going to be a surprise. But when you need to know what the world thinks about Native people, or you need to know anything about the world, you just Google it, right? Google has all the answers, and we teach our students just Google things and magically answers will appear, and you don't have to be critical consumers of information. The Googles are the answer all the time, right? Okay, yes, I'm being sarcastic. So let's Google and look at the top images for Mexican American. And these are screenshots from about 5 years ago. So I'd be interested when we're done here, you go ahead and Google in the background and see how it shows up for you and your algorithms right now. And yes, Donald Trump made it into the Mexican American images. So like I said, Google has all the answers. All right, what about Asian American? So if we Google Asian American, these are the top images that show up. If we Google African American, these are the top images that show up. And if we Google Native American, who wants to point out the obvious? And I'm a teacher, so I'm okay with wait time.
I do have a comment about this this page. I during the last 3 years of Indigenous Peoples Day, departments have taken it upon themselves to make their own flyers, which is quite wonderful, and I applaud them for that. But they all seem to use pictures of pre-1900 context. So we even have to teach our own campuses that we are not pre-1900 context, because I've seen these pictures used for those flyers. So just something to think about.
Exactly. It's the default. American Indians are basically sepia tone, black and white, Plains Indian stereotypes. And I said 574 federally recognized tribes. A lot of those tribes are in Alaska. These do not look like Alaska Natives. All right. A lot of those tribes are coming from the East Coast. These do not look like East Coast Woodlands folks. All right. These are Great Plains males. All right. Plus, you got interesting Coachella music festival person in the upper right, female headdress wearer, whatever that is. All right, because that's the type of appropriation that also occurs from all this. But this is the imagery that is dominating so much stuff. So to Deborah's point, and yes, there are the comments coming through in the chat. There's no representation of modern peoples. Where are the modern Indians? All right, so if you're going to make a flyer, just make a conscious decision. Let's go get a modern Native picture. All right, where can I find it? And in fact, when you do this Google search, is anybody doing it in the background? How'd it go?
There's a few more modern images now, but even still, the modern images are like it's people wearing traditional clothing. There's not like, with the Mexican Americans and the Asian Americans, African Americans, like they're people living their daily like lives, and all the images that are coming up are like of traditional celebrations. And so there's some more modern imagery, but it's still not like embracing them as Native people as just people.
Yeah, people really like the cultural exhibition pictures, drum and feather context is what I call it. And so it's not like those aren't important to us, but one of the things that's really important to kind of think about is we actually, for the very first time ever with our Indigenous Peoples Day we had on Monday, is the first time we've ever invited dancers and singers, because we are conscious from the very beginning. It's our eighth one, and the theme was about music and arts. And so we thought, okay, now's the time to actually bring this forward. But we have consciously stayed away from that because we know that people want to come take that picture, which I took those pictures. Man, we had those kid dancers. They were awesome. I was really feeling it in my heart. They were these young dancers, up and coming. The singers were great. It was all good. But we know that people will show up and they'll take that picture and they won't listen to the substance of those conversations. They won't listen to federal trust responsibility, missing and murdered Indigenous women, new authors and writers in literature, making comic books and artists like that. And so that's what we're trying to do. But this imagery is what dominates everything. And if you can just get one thing away, is consciously recognizing this imagery showing up over and over again every time American Indians are around, this really just is, we're trying to break through that. All right. So if you make a conscious effort to, nope, I'm going to swap this out with a modern native. All right. We're making progress. So if we get into the actual research, so this is when we talk about media, simple internet image search, basically, if you actually unpacked the first 100 images or 200 images, basically 95% of Google image returns and 99% of Bing shows up as those images. And that was in 2015. So that was published in 2015. I appreciate this quote right here when we're talking about Native Americans in the social studies. We see them as welcoming European settlers, joining them in a Thanksgiving Day celebration, guiding them as they explore the West, being massacred as settlers pushed westward, and finally being removed and subdued by Andrew Jackson. After the Trail of Tears, American Indians disappear from the pages of our textbooks and the curriculum, and for our students, American Indians are museum exhibits. This is K-12. This is higher ed. When people think about where do we study American Indians, history and anthropology. History and anthropology is inherently where Indians are learned about. But we have American Indian businessmen, we have American Indian economics, we have food sovereignty and American Indian food systems, we have American Indian artists, we have American Indian XYZ, all these subspecialties. Indigenous studies is inherently attached to every single profession in every degree program at every university. If you want to go become a nurse, pre-nursing, Indian Health Services is a unique system that you need to probably understand. So those things are attached to all programs of study. Indians are not just for history and anthropology. But if we look at how history dominates this narrative, so 2015, there was a study by Sarah Shear and a handful of others, and they found that 87% of social studies standards on American Indians are in a pre-1900 context. That's a 50-state study. So remember, states' rights, states run education. Okay, so every state has a Department of Ed, and every Department of Ed has some sort of policy and curriculum around social studies, civics, et cetera, et cetera. A study of history standards across the United States found that 87% of what students are supposed to learn are that image. That's by design. That's curriculum. That's also the power of systems and status quos. Okay, when a teacher starts, they really need that textbook. All right. So think about the kids coming into K-State and what they know. Well, they've been exposed to these textbooks from these big textbook companies. Textbooks build their textbook around state standards. Okay, so we replicate the problem. All right. Textbooks and supplemental teaching materials offered to teachers have the same issues. Okay, well, then let's think about other books. Children's books, same problems. All right, this is changing in recent, like there's a growth, and there's a kind of a moment for representation in Indian country right now in the past 5 years, especially. It's been growing since the early 2000s, but those status quos are still around. So basically, if you unpack diversity in children's books, I think this is really important. American Indians are so underrepresented. And so in 2016, 3,400 children's books were created. Of those, about 35 were about natives. And of those 35, 8 of those books about natives were written by native authors. So that's also a layer in this whole thing. You have a whole lot of non-Indians writing about Indians. And that's dominating the narrative. And there's this nostalgia and there's really a fetishism about American Indians in that headdress type, exotic other kind of context. And that seeps into children's books. That seeps into textbooks. That seeps into all these things. And it also seeps into, oh, by the way, I love this figure. In picture books for children, talking bears outnumber Native Americans 9-1. So you're learning more about talking bears than you are about Native Americans. So why would we expect any different if all of these learning environments and your go-to Indian movies? All right, I don't know if this tells how old I am or how old some people are in this versus others. We won't get into that, all right? But these are the go-to Indian movies of that era. And you know what? They were progress too. They represented progress in some ways as well. You had in Dances with Wolves, they're using their language, all right, in accurate ways. They're not just putting dark makeup on white people and putting a black wig on them, which they did all the previous generations of movies about Indians, all the Westerns. These are your go-to Indian movies, same imagery. All right. It's the same imagery. And if we're being honest, these are two movies about white guys, but they're Indian movies, but they're about white people. So you see how Indians are relegated to the background, that exotic other kind of window dressing around this dominant narrative. So what does the research say on mascots? And this is why I think it's really important. People get real, I don't know what it is about mascots. Like people are so attached to them and it lurches the conversation out of substance. And people are talking about like Chiefs versus Redskins and which one's worse and which one's not worse. No, you have to place mascots alongside media representation, curriculum, textbooks, children's books, and all these things that are propping up this same narrative. The Google image search I showed you is how mascots are represented. All right. So mascots are also a teaching tool. Mascots create a learning environment, and mascots are a curriculum. All right. I call it the mascot curriculum. When they go to your social studies class and they're learning by standards that only reinforce stuck in the past narratives, and they had children's books exposed, and the movies that the social studies teacher is showing are the same stuck in the past imagery, and then they go to the Friday night football game, and then they watch the Chiefs on Sunday. They're getting it over and over and over and over again. And it's part of a larger dominant narrative. All right. And if you're watching the Chiefs game on Sunday or actually it's Thursday night, I think this week, and you're seeing that tomahawk chop, that's people are learning. Kids are watching and kids are learning. All right. So I always tell this story about, I ran into somebody and they're like, they hear my last name's Redcorn. They're like, oh, that's an interesting name. Okay. Yeah. Where's it come from? Oh, well, it's an Osage name. Well, I end up in this conversation a lot, especially since I passed for white too. So people are kind of like doing the calculus. They're like, well, this guy's not wearing a headdress right now, but his last name's Redcorn, so that sounds legit. How should I listen to it? How should I perceive this guy? I've been in those conversations over and over plenty of times. But she came around and she said, oh, I thought the Osage were extinct. So this is how people view us. All right. This is the background information that most of the students entering your classroom have. And therefore, we are agents of change within these systems. So how do we disrupt that? All right. And we have over 20,000 citizens. They don't just live in Oklahoma. You're about to see them all over because of Killers of the Flower Moon. They're already all over. You've probably seen Chief Standing Bear standing next to Leonardo DiCaprio and Martin Scorsese on your Facebook feed. If you've seen the trailer for Killers of the Flower Moon, there's actually Redcorns in that movie in the trailer. And so some of my cousins are in there because they really wanted to partner with the Osage community. And so, no, we're not extinct. And that's part of what, if you hear them talk about that movie, there was a point where they realized they had to scrap the whole script. Scorsese and DiCaprio were like, we're making this movie and it's about the FBI. It's another white savior story. How can we center the Osage experience instead of just talk about the white folks with Osage background context? And so that's kind of where we're trying to push these narratives. And so this is what we're fighting against. I thought the Osage were extinct. And if you get into the Kansas social studies standards, these are the kids entering our classrooms. You start looking around. And by the way, KSDE, Kansas State Department of Ed, is trying to fix this right now. We're having listening sessions with several communities saying, how should we be talking about American Indians in Kansas classrooms? But the document the social studies document as it exists right now, if you do a keyword search, you will find societies of North America, ancient to the 1400s, 1000s to the 1600s, 1600s to the 1760s, 1870s to 1900. So you see, even in the headings of our textbooks and the headings of our documents, you will see things like the vanishing Indian, and you see those things end at 1900. So we're working on this, though. If you get into tribally specific mentions, they use the term Kanza once in the social studies standards. And by the way, the social studies standards, it can get kind of funny, standards versus appendices. So if you want to go off into those weeds, then we can do that. But I don't think anybody here is looking to. But if you look in there, Kanza shows up twice. But the terms Osage, Pawnee, Kiowa, Comanche, Potawatomi, Kickapoo, Sac and Fox, or Iowa are not in those documents. So that's that erasure and that's that invisibility. If you get into the concept of sovereignty and civics, so it is essential. This study came out in 2021. It was just like the history standards that were researched by Sarah Shear. She's also on this one with Subzalian, and they basically did a 50-state scan of civics curricula, asking the question, are people learning about Native nations and tribal sovereignty and governance? And it is essential to point out that 14 states, and Kansas is one of them, did not include indigenous nationhood at all within their K-12 civic standards. Okay, so this is the status quo we're working with. And it really comes around to take a moment to consider if everything you learned about white people was through the lens of a Civil War soldier. That seems ridiculous because we interact with white people. We learn about all kinds of white people post 1900. We see them on TV every day. All right. We see them in normal contexts all the time. But so much is flowing through that stuck in the past imagery, and so much learning is stemming from it, where if we can just start disrupting that, then we can start actually preparing our students to interact with Native peoples in Kansas. Because there are almost 10,000 students who marked American Indian Alaska Native on their self-select in K-12 schools. All right. So they're here. They may not look like the stereotype you're looking for, but they're here. So basically it comes around to, how do we ensure that our citizens learn about contemporary American Indians? How do we ensure our citizens know that Native nations with history in Kansas still exist in contemporary form in Oklahoma, a lot of them? Honestly, if there's one thing you can do, just Google their website. Every tribe has a website, and they got a history tab, they got a culture tab, they have TV stations and media channels where you can bring that imagery, that modern contextualized imagery, into your classroom. And are our teachers or educators required to learn about contemporary American Indians? So you all are here voluntarily, right? But how much within our systems are people learning? Because the people, remember, I'm ed leadership. The thing that will drive improving your system and meeting your students' learning goals more than anything is the quality of the teachers you put in front of them, the quality of the student-teacher interaction. And if our teachers are ill-prepared, then we're only going to replicate these status quos with our students when they go out and become professionals in the world. And so how can we disrupt that status quo? And where are the representation of indigenous peoples? Where are these modern, colorful pictures? All right, where are those stories? And how do we change that narrative? And so if you learn one thing, and I'm going to move to questions here in a second, but if you learn one thing, just connect the past to the present. We have to connect the past to the present. Our histories are still unfolding. We're not past tense people. When people talk about Indians, you will hear people use past tense all the time. Native people were here. They were here. Well, I'm sitting right here working for Kansas State University. All right. We just had a little soldier dance troupe, those kids that have a whole life ahead of them. We got these people, we're in Kansas, we are Kansas, we're Kansas history, but we're also Kansas present. And one of our cultural traits is being forward-thinking people. So I always talk about, I have Osage elders that say, one of our cultural traditions is we're forward-thinking people. We move forward, we adapt. All right. And it's in our origin stories. You can hear those things in our origin stories about how we are constantly adapting to the world around us. And you can see it in the strategic decision making. So when you go out and you finally watch the 3-hour saga of Killers of the Flower Moon, you have to think about, there were Osage leaders who were making strategic political decisions while Oklahoma was trying to become a state. They made strategic decisions when they were being kicked out of Kansas. All right. And they made strategic decisions because they could make way for their future generations. And so that is what's driving a lot of decision making, and that future forward thinking adaptive type of mentality is embedded into our cultures. We're not just stuck in the past people. So we won't do breakouts, but I want to just ask the question, reflecting on your experiences as a student or a teacher, in what ways do these stereotypes show up in your classrooms? So you remember you were a student, but you were also educators, textbooks, media, other learning environments. How often have your students been exposed to American Indian contexts outside of drum and feather contexts? Have they talked about sovereignty and economic development, or are they just taking pictures of the Little Soldier Dance Troupe when they're here? Have you already taken steps to remedy some of these issues in your classrooms? What are some lessons, units, or curricular decisions or structures that may be due for an update? And we're not going to do a breakout, so you don't have to offer a summary when you return. But I'm going to finish up talking. I'd like to hear from folks. What are people's thoughts on this, and how it's unfolding in your immediate environment as either a learner or an educator?
There's a good question in the chat.
Gotcha. So what do you think the implications are, implications will be of the current political climate? Okay, so yes, that's always a fun answer, because attacks on diversity in higher education. So one of the ways that I reframe those conversations is, this is not critical race theory. We're talking about tribal sovereignty and co-governance structures. All right, so tribal sovereignty is a thing, and these tribal governments exist. They are real governments that exist next to municipal governments, alongside state governments, and alongside the federal government. And so these conversations are really about tribal sovereignty and making sure that a state system that controls education is working with a tribal governance system to try to make sure it's appropriate and they're actually serving the community. Not just all about making white people feel bad about themselves. We're moving beyond that. All right. This is a much more substantive conversation about governance structures and collaboration and community engagement. But yes, that's a challenge. As an example, the state of South Dakota. So the work we're trying to do in Kansas State Department of Ed in collaboration with the tribes is the Kansas State Department of Ed and the tribes are all talking to one another, and we're trying to build a new set of essential understandings and a teacher toolkit to be able to help connect the dots better for learning about tribes that have histories and connections to Kansas. All right. So we're trying to do that, and it's usually framed around essential understandings. We're about like the 15th state to do it. This is not new. All right. You go up into Washington, Montana, Oregon, all around the Great Lakes. You have the Southwest. These states are already doing this work. South Dakota did it. They have these great indigenous essential understandings, collaboratively developed with the tribes in South Dakota. And DEIB work basically nullified it last year. So all this work, this great document, but it basically got gutted and nullified because of state politics, anti-diversity state politics. However, one of the ways we're approaching this in Kansas is we are working, just like I'm talking to you here, we are working with ideas in motion with the people that are putting them together. And we're not necessarily coming at this as we need to mandate this. That might come later at some point. But when you come at it as we're going to mandate everything, then all of a sudden it hits these diversity triggers a little bit differently. But if you go talk to teachers across the country and teachers and educators who want to do something and want to improve, they're just scared of how to go about it and they need a little help. that becomes a much more powerful thing that goes beyond state policies about DEIB. It's really about reframing that conversation around, we have these tribes in Kansas, and they have tribes in Oklahoma that have students in Kansas. Not everybody from these Oklahoma tribes are staying in Oklahoma, by the way. People like me, the Osage, like I'm in Kansas. These are our community members. These are our community stakeholders within the state. So we're trying to better prepare people to be community members alongside those organizations and those people. That was a long-winded answer, but hopefully that. Okay, Carrie's going to put me on the spot here. All right. Yeah, I was disappointed too. So Carrie put in here that I'm deeply disturbed that Coach Tang is featured as KSU night speaker. That's the reality of what we deal with all the time. And I was upset and very disappointed, I think is how I'll say that. And especially when you contrast it with, so you got these images on the internet of Coach Tang singing along, banging a drum to a mass audience and how excited he was about it. But I give you a contrasting image of the Little Soldier Dance Troupe in the K-State Student Union dancing around that Wildcat. You have those two images and they're very dissonant from one another. And I think, I don't know Coach Tang personally, but when you have those things, just like that lady that said, oh, I thought the Osage were extinct. All right. You have people that aren't making Native people real in their head. And so they don't necessarily see the harm because everything has been framed around Native people were here long ago, or that we're honoring you by singing a fake Indian song in front of 80,000 people on national TV. All right. That disconnect and that cognitive dissonance is there. And I think it's really important to, when we have those conversations, we show what's happening in the media, and we show how the mascots cause damage, because you contrast that with the image of these actual Native kids singing actual traditional songs in their actual regalia, and getting up to the microphone to say their name in front of a crowd of people because they're practicing. That Little Soldier Dance Troupe is trying to build those kids up as future leaders. And so that is what we need to shift the narrative to make sure that people understand that Native people are real and these kids are watching. Other questions?
I wanted to add something, if you don't mind. A couple of things. And one of the things that was so cool about the Little Soldier Dance Group, that the one little girl did the dance all on her own, and maybe people didn't, she had Down syndrome. And it was just our celebration of no matter who you are, and I'm being kicked off or something. Anyway, that was one thing was such a celebration to me. But one of the things that I notice in doing this work on the campus, that many people do not understand their own socialization that leads to these concepts of anybody under that diversity tag is, thank you for doing that, still seen as outsiders. I teach diversity in higher education for the College of Education. I don't use the textbook because the textbook has people as if they're outsiders. We have to stop looking at us as outsiders. We're part of the story. And if you don't understand your own socialization that leads to those types of exclusionary ideals, it's time to start learning those, because you're not going to learn them in school. Your children aren't learning them. The students that we have today at Kansas State University don't really have that. But I applaud the college, our College of Education, as great leaders to put up this Indigenous studies and really teaching that concept and driving the process home. Oh, and that was, I meant to say, I do teach that, but I was given the option of not using that textbook. They're going by what I was suggesting, which was also a great honor. So I didn't mean to finish that thought. Anyway, just understanding how we are building leadership for Indigenous leadership on this campus, thanks to the College of Education, but also telling you, please learn your own history so that you know your own culture. Every human has a culture. That's all.
And thank you for that. And I know that we're coming up on time, I believe, and folks are going to have to take off. But yeah, I just wanted to leave you with this picture of Indigenous futures. This was great and heartwarming to see these kids dancing on Monday. So with that, I'll turn it back over. Don, and let you close us out, I assume.
Yes, thank you so much. First of all, please help me in thanking Dr. Redcorn for the very excellent talk he just gave. As always, we'll be posting this online tomorrow, or actually probably even a little bit later today for asynchronous viewing. So please let your colleagues know that that is available. We have a post-event survey, and this is part of our professional development program. If you'd like to earn a certificate, my colleagues will drop the information in our chat. And again, this is part of a conversation we need to continue to have as we all continue to learn. And I think as you started, Dr. Redcorn, you said we're going to start to evolve together today. I hope that we continue to evolve together. But thank you all for being here. I really appreciate your participation.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.